Welcome back to our continuing look at Inspiring Philosophy's video, The Imperfect Mosaic Law. As mentioned in part 2 of this one-part series, we're not looking at every line in Michael's video, and we're skipping around a bit for the sake of the narrative. So let's just hop right back in. Mike?
We're not saying that because the Torah was not a perfect moral code, that it was necessarily bad. We are simply noting the Torah was not meant to be universal moral legislation, and it was cultural wisdom for that time and place. In other words, it was perfect for where the people were spiritually, in that time and place, within that culture, but not meant to be moral wisdom or rules for all people or all cultures.
A light unto the nations. Actually, no, more like just another nation without any transcendent guidance, embracing and proliferating some really immoral ideas like slavery, genocide, homophobia, and misogyny. Michael, you don't need a god for any of that. Cultural wisdom for that time and place just happens naturally, all by itself. In fact, I think it's clear from what Michael has said here that we'd all have been a lot better off had God just kept his mouth shut. I mean, if it was just cultural wisdom for that time and place, we likely would have grown out of that a lot quicker had people not believed that those bits of cultural wisdom from that time and place, especially the admittedly immoral passages, were wisdom handed down from an all-knowing, all-loving super being.
It was not laying down a universal moral code. Humanity was not ready for such a revelation yet.
Apparently, we still aren't ready for God's perfect universal moral code, because God hasn't updated anything significantly since, aside from having his boy/self tortured and killed. And isn't Jesus' sacrifice proof that we'd never be ready for God's perfect moral code, that we'd never be able to live up to it? It's not like we even lived up to God's imperfect moral code, so why not just give us the perfect moral code for guidance, both now and later, since we were bound to fail regardless. God, revealing his perfect moral code 3,000 plus years ago, whether humanity was ready for it or not, would have given humans in the future reason to believe that the Israelites were indeed communicating with a morally transcendent being. God forbid. Then there's this. God, knowing the results of failing to reveal his perfect moral code, as he did, like slavery continuing in the Judeo-Christian world for another several thousand years, bringing with it endless death, suffering, and injustice, that makes God morally culpable for all of it. God failed to do anything to stop the horrors which he absolutely knew would be forthcoming, based largely on his imperfect moral code, which allowed for slavery, homophobia, misogyny, and even genocide. Even worse yet, God not giving us his perfect moral code earlier means that anyone saying slavery or the murder of homosexuals is wrong later in history can be dismissed by those following God's imperfect moral code. Because remember, God is unchanging and morally perfect. Isn't that exactly what some believers still say? Isn't that exactly what fundamentalism is? For an all-knowing being, this guy's as stupid, as vicious, as incompetent as they come, at least according to Michael.
It was perfect for where the people were spiritually, in that time and place, within that culture, but not meant to be moral wisdom or rules for all people or all cultures.
Okay, so these last two comments about humanity not being ready for God's perfect moral code, and the code God did give not being for all peoples or cultures, brings us to the heart of the tribal war god of Abraham's stupidity, viciousness, and incompetence. Michael is not a young earth creationist. So if we're going to go with Low-Bar Bill's assessment, humans with souls have been around since Homo heidelbergensis, 750,000 years ago. If we're just talking about modern humans, we're still looking at up to 300,000 years. That's a long time. So why weren't humans ready yet, some 3,000 years ago, for God's perfect moral code? God had 300,000 years to prep us? Clearly, the tribal war god of Abraham is the supernatural realm's biggest procrastinator. He waited around until the very last minute and then realized, oh my heck, if I were speaking as a Mormon, I can't give my people the perfect moral code I wanted to give them because I needed to do a whole bunch of prep work, which I've been putting off for the better part of a million years. Let me quote my old buddy Dennis Prager here. God created man without giving him a 10 Commandments or any other revealed moral instruction. The only moral code was the one God built into the human being, the conscience. Clearly, this was not enough to make a good world. For hundreds of thousands of years, Michael's God just let humanity wallow in their depravity, killing, raping, stealing, torturing, and, God forbid, coveting and mixing fabrics. Meanwhile, God was on the back nine at Augusta with Zeus, reading the greens with unrivaled precision. Michael's God couldn't be bothered to give humans the moral guidance needed to make a good world, not even his imperfect moral code for hundreds of thousands of years. And when he finally did, he picked a small group of desert dwellers and left it at that? Really? So even then, the vast majority of people on the planet were still left with none of the necessary moral guidance from God needed to make a good world? Is this even slightly believable? He's all-knowing and all-loving, and this is really the best he could do? He couldn't begin the moral guidance much earlier when modern humans were just starting out? They'd all have had the same moral guidance from the same moral source as they spread across the globe. Imagine how unifying and transcendent that would have been. Worst of all, God left all of these people for hundreds of thousands of years in the worst possible state, without any meaning, hope, or purpose. They never knew they were special, made in God's image. They never knew that God had a plan for their lives and that God loved them. He left them to be atheists. And if God procrastinated, as Michael makes clear, then he had at least some moral obligation when finally getting around to things to reveal this imperfect as it was moral guidance to all people. Didn't he? Not just some little group wandering around the Fertile Crescent. Is there anyone who expects less of their morally perfect being than the Christians? Did Lobar Bill say we should lower our moral standards along with our epistemic standards? I don't remember that. Later, Michael plays some video of John Walton, professor of Old Testament at Wheaton College.
That explains why we do not find in the Torah any discussion of, is it a good thing to have slaves? Yeah. Those aren't issues on the table in the ancient world. And Torah is not going to deal with them. It's not presenting an ideal system. It's telling them how to live in the system that exists in their day. There's no discussion about whether democracy might be a more humane government than monarchy. We talked about this some yesterday. There's no discussion of whether patriarchy and male domination is a sensible thing. That's how it was in the ancient world. God wasn't trying to create a new social system for them. He was trying to tell them how to live without reproach in the systems that existed.
There's no discussion of those things in the Gospels or the epistles either. So clearly this is how we should view the New Testament as well. God still has yet to give us his ideal, perfect moral code. The New Testament was simply telling people how to live in the system that existed in their day. So those of us living in the 21st century can dismiss and ignore the New Testament the way Christians dismiss and ignore the Torah. Good to know.
Now the question might arise as to why God couldn't just make Israel better by giving them an ideal moral code right away. Well, probably for the same reason we wouldn't expect a sociopath to be able to run an orphanage.
Michael, the phone call is coming from inside the house. The sociopath is your God. He ordered the murder of babies, which I'm sure you have a very good excuse for. But he also ordered the murder of homosexuals, young girls who didn't bleed on their wedding night. He allowed and codified slavery and the sale of daughters into slavery. You know, those immoral passages you've admitted to. if you don't want a sociopath running an orphanage, you gotta stand with me against this God guy, Mike, because he's running the entire showdown here.
People and societies need time to progress towards a more virtuous way of thinking. If you expect too much at first from a depraved mind, you're actually more likely to hinder them instead of helping them progress to a better place.
Oh, so it's our fault your God, the tribal war god of Abraham, is a moral monster with his depraved mind? We expected too much of this morally perfect being? How is that even possible? Once again, I'm me. Thanks for watching.